Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell, and today's webinar is Camera Trapped Wildlife Photography in the West, presented by NatHab expedition leaders and pro photographers Charlie Reinertsen and Rylee Jensen. Thank you so much for being here today, Charlie and Rylee. Over to you.
Thanks, Brooke, and thanks for everyone for joining. Really excited today. We're going to talk about Riley, your photography. Thanks so much for being on to be able to take a look at your photographs.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about it. Charlie and I haven't seen each other since September when we guided last, so it's nice to chat with you again.
Yeah, it's so fun to like think about being out in Yellowstone and Grand Teton. We have a lot of overlap in terms of like having master's degrees and working, looking at ecological systems, and we'll get into that a little bit and talk about your graduate research, which I'm excited to get into. But something that was really fun for both of us when we were guiding is to be able to chat about photography, and I'd love to just jump right in and just talk about how did you first get into photography? What drew you to this as a way of capturing the world around you?
Yeah, so my earliest memory with photography, I think began when I was around like 13 or 14. I just picked up my parents' already like point and shoot camera that we had, and I just kind of began taking pictures around my neighborhood. So trying to do some like artsy flower pictures and trying to get like neighborhood squirrels and ducks, that kind of thing. And this like fascination with I've always had this fascination with the natural world. Like I'm the kid that grew up on like Steve Irwin and Wild Kingdom documentaries. So I think naturally that just came to me to do photography along with my own curiosity with the natural world. So did a lot of photography around my neighborhood when I was a teenager and in high school. And then I went to college at Utah State in Logan, Utah, and I joined the wildlife ecology program there. That's what I got my bachelor's degree in. So each summer I would do a different summer internship around the country to just gain more field experience and also to just see other parts of the country that I thought were really beautiful. So during this time, while during the school year, we did a lot of field trips up to places like Yellowstone and the Tetons. A lot of my advisors are researchers themselves, so they um, did some really cool field trips with us to Yellowstone to learn about the wolf reintroduction up there. We visited the Tetons in the fall specifically to look for elk and moose during the rut, and also down to southern Utah too during wildlife conferences. So I spent a lot of time in Bryce Canyon and Cedar Breaks National Monument, Cedar Mesa for personal backpacking trips. So I just brought my camera along with me on a lot of these research trips and conferences that I would be going to otherwise, and then just really got some practice along the way too with trying different angles and trying different photography subjects, playing with my camera settings a little bit more. It's funny looking back on some of these early photos that I've taken. Some of them I like, really love, and I cherish all of these photos as long as I've been doing photography. And then some of them I'm like, oh, if I had just known at the time, like I would have done my settings differently, or I would have gotten a different angle in this way. But yeah, I think just getting that practice, even though I didn't have like super high tech gear at the time, just spending a lot of time outdoors and just playing with my own style and seeing how that's evolved over the years has really been nice for me.
Yeah, so when you're saying some of your earlier photos, are we looking at these ones here? Are some of these from your early photos, or are these more recent?
Yeah, no, these are some of my early photos. So the Tetons, that was during one of those field trips, probably around like 2016 or 2017. The Fox and Orca were taken on San Juan Island in Washington. So I did an internship there in 2015 and 2016, those 2 summers. And I was studying orca behavior there. So really great opportunity to dive into wildlife photography and do it in such a fascinating place. So San Juan Island will always be near and dear to my heart for that in that reason. And then the bottom right photo is Bryce Canyon National Park. So I would go there with my family or just on personal field trips. So, and that's just, naturally just such a good photographic landscape. It's hard to take a bad picture in Bryce Canyon.
Absolutely. That picture of the Tetons with the Alpenglow in the morning, just that one really is amazing. And I know the next slide, so I love seeing like this early fox picture, and then what we're about to look at in the next one
Hmm.
just kind of shows your trajectory and what how you've been approaching your photography. So
Hmm.
let's pop over to that one and see. Let's see, make sure it's catching up. Uh, is that showing up for you? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there we go.
this picture is stunning. I mean, the clarity in the eyes, the emotion behind that image.
Hmm.
Just like I love this one. And when you're looking, when you're thinking about the images that you want to get, and you're out, maybe in Yellowstone or Grand Teton, um, what are the types of images that you're trying to get, like that you're chasing and thinking about?
So initially, when I started focusing more on wildlife as my primary subjects, I was really drawn initially to this portrait style photography where the animal's looking right at you. And you can see its face, you can see it like very clearly head on. And so I think that brings a lot of emotion just naturally into these pictures. And some subjects, like foxes, they always have wild facial expressions. So I say that, some animals are easier to bring that out of than others. Foxes, I still really love doing portrait photography with them because they're just one of my favorite animals to photograph in that way. But if you go to the next slides too, I've also been more drawn to behaviors over the years. And so, and it varies subject to subject too. So with wolves, for example, I photograph a lot of wolves in Yellowstone, particularly this winter. They've been really active. And just knowing things about wolf ecology and wolf behavior, I try to actually capture those photos in time, more so than just, like a wolf watching me. So, for example, for wolves, I like to show portraits of their behavior. So, predator prey interactions. We'll see if some of these photos pull up.
Yeah, let me stop sharing and then jump back into it again because it's
Okay.
seems
I
like
tried, I
it's
did some like
struggling.
animations on each of them to pop up like one at a time. Maybe that's what's going on.
Oh, so maybe I needed to keep clicking on that. Yeah, let me try that again. Just a second.
Charlie, while you're doing that, we just have a couple comments that it's a little hard to hear you. Is there a way to increase the gain on, do you have like a mic that you're using or anything? Or is
Make
it just
sure
the
I'm
standard mic?
talking more loudly. It's on auto.
Oh, okay,
And
okay.
I've been getting a little closer to the speaker as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Here it
Oh,
is. Yeah, I just needed to keep clicking. I'm sorry,
no, it's
Riley.
you're totally fine. um, yeah, so
So
pictures like
you're
this, it's really what I strive for, where like knowing about wolf ecology, they have a, really important relationship with their prey, especially in wintertime when here in Yellowstone, the main packs that take up the interior of the park are hunting bison because elk migrate out of the park in the wintertime. So I've really been striving to get this predator prey relationship on camera. And this photo I took just a couple weeks ago. There was a bunch of bison in a field, two, I'm assuming sub-adult or young adult wolves kind of in the mix with them. So I liked this photo a lot, how this turned out, where they're both kind of looking the same way. And you can somewhat see like the size comparison between the two.
It's
And then,
really interesting. And then, I mean, I imagine just from a technical standpoint, this would have been kind of tricky to get the focus where you wanted it.
mhm.
You must have been a manual focus or at least pinpoint trying to grab onto the wolf because I imagine if you're using autofocus, it might want to focus in on those bison. I love that you put the wolf in focus.
Yeah, more often than not, I actually find myself using the like single point autofocus so that I can maneuver it on my screen and actually find the focus point that I really want. And so for this one, obviously, I wanted the wolf in focus as like the main where your eye goes first to like draw immediately to the predator in this picture. But you also want to capture the bison and at least show your audience that there are bison in this picture. So I bumped up my f-stop to, I think this is like F9 or F10, so that the details on the bison also show up in this picture.
Yeah,
But yeah, I was really happy with how this came out.
that's really neat. I feel like this, often this moment is so fleeting. Just like thinking about the logistics of what you needed to do to get in position, get the right shot, get the focus right. I think that's
Yeah.
a really, really neat shot.
Sometimes in Yellowstone, you really have to just start your day like imagining what you want and then having your settings ready to go. So when that moment does happen and it's really, really quick, you are already on the ball and you know what you want to
Yeah,
get.
absolutely. Very cool. And this next shot that you have here, I mean, just the playfulness of it, just being able to capture that moment. And again, I mean, this is another tricky focusing situation where you have that branch that's giving you such a nice depth in the image, but then your focus is just right on with the wolves in the background.
Yeah, this picture was interesting because we were watching wolves at a carcass and the rangers were keeping us at exactly 100 yards away. So it was actually like a very nicely managed situation so that we could just sit with the wolves for a long time and just watch them at this carcass site. And naturally, when you have a carcass, most of the pack is also going to be there. So then once they're full and they've kind of like gotten what they need to out of the carcass, that's when you start to see a lot more behaviors happen. So I was kind of positioned in a way in front of the snow coach where I couldn't really move without losing my spot. So ideally, I actually wouldn't have gotten that branch in the foreground because I don't really love covering like faces in pictures. But I'm glad that I was still able to get this little interaction between the two through the branches. And you're right, yeah, it kind of adds like a depth to it to show that they're in the woods a little bit. So I'm really happy
Yeah.
with how that came out
And
too.
to me, it almost makes me feel like I'm kind of peering in on them and like that I'm closer to the action. Because if I picture that branch not being there, I almost feel like it's maybe it would be harder to relate to the image or feel like you're in the scene itself. So I
Hmm.
feel like that's, I hear you saying you wish the branch wasn't there, but I think it's a happy accident.
Yeah, there's a lot of those in the field.
And I'm so jealous of these two wolf pictures because it's so clear. Obviously, we'll talk about this a little bit later too, but like winter wildlife watching opportunities in Yellowstone are just so different
Hmm.
than what you might come across in summer. So
Yeah,
that's
it's
just
like a
unique.
completely different park in the winter.
Yeah. What length lens do you remember were you using with these?
Um, 100% of the time that I'm in the field, I'm bringing my 100 to 400. I actually really do want to upgrade to either a 5 or 600. Just working on funds right now. But yeah, I was probably at like a full 400 millimeter length for that.
Yeah.
So to get these shots too, you have to be as close as possible with your lens at least.
Yeah.
So it was nice that they were just, essentially right in front of us. So I could just kind of capture this behavior as it all happened.
That's amazing. Very cool. All right, let's see this next one here because this one was also amazing. So we're obviously we're not in Yellowstone here anymore.
No, this is on the Katmai coast. So I
Yeah.
guess north, I guess you could say. But yeah, so with wolves, I was talking about how I really love capturing, predator prey interactions and pack dynamics because that's so integral to their behavior and what makes wolves so unique as a species. But then on the flip side, with bears, I do a lot of bear photography up in Alaska, but there are also, grizzly bears and black bears and the Tetons in Yellowstone. And I really love seeking out bears, showing their softer side, since I feel like bears, especially in the West, can kind of get a bad rap when you hear about like attacks and bears being brutal and ferocious. So I try to show their softer side through my pictures to show that they are really doting mothers and they really do have relationships with each other that maybe we don't like fully understand. But bears playing is obviously like a favorite of mine because they're just goofy. Like a lot of their behavior is really similar to what I find in like dogs. So watching them play together is always such a treat, and you just realize, if they're happy, they're gonna express that in the form of play or whatever else. So I liked capturing a lot of bear playing moments this summer.
Yeah. And so for someone who might not know, describe geographically where this is, this shot.
So this photo was taken in Katmai National Park on the coast. So I guess I try to show this like through here. This is my map of Alaska, of my backwards map. Actually, this might be better. So this is the state of Alaska, and Katmai is right over here. Or no, sorry, on the Alaska Peninsula, going out to the coast. So it's like right around here on the coast. And Bristol Bay is the bay that feeds into this national park, and so there's so much salmon that come through the rivers here, and that it's one of the best places in the world to see wild bears because of the salmon that are moving through these rivers and these streams and tributaries there. So it's a really great place to just see this natural relationship play out that's been playing out for millennia, basically. So actually, that leads into my next picture that I like to show with bears, which is that bear salmon relationship. And so, salmon in Alaska not only feed bears, but also feed wolves and eagles and seals and sea lions and whales and human communities too. So, over time being in Alaska, I've really been more drawn to photographing salmon and how they give life to these ecosystems in that way.
Yeah, I mean, the picture on the bottom left of the grizzly bears together, just looking at their heel pads, like I feel like that alone, and even like the paw that's up over the head of the other one, and the claws are up on top, like what you're trying to achieve of showing the goofy, gentle nature of these animals. I feel like that comes across perfectly. And then like how you've used shallow depth of field to kind of soften the whole image. Well, one thing I was wondering just about exposure of that shot, like these bears happen to be pretty blonde on the Yellowstone images. A couple of the wolves are pretty dark and the bison are dark.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the ways that you kind of balance the exposure of the image while also remaining true to what it's like to see this animal in the wild? Like I know personally when I'm editing bison photos, it's hard to decide how much to open up the shadows because
Mm-hmm.
inherently it's a really dark animal and their fur absorbs a lot of the light. Like, do you find
Yeah.
yourself kind of struggling with that or figuring out where the right exposure level is?
Yeah, it's really tricky, especially in the winter, because you have, especially on sunny days like this, you have such bright white snow, and then you have dark animals. So you have to really find a good balance with that exposure. So I feel like more often than not, what I do is focus on not blowing out the highlights of the snow. So I'm at really high f-stops a lot of the time to not make the snow just look completely blown out and too white. Because I'm also thinking about how I can edit my photos post production. And so with this wolf picture, for the top left wolf picture, I was more focused on, again, yeah, like not blowing out the highlights of the snow because I knew that I could bring up the shadows of the bison and the wolf in Lightroom later on. So once you kind of have a feel for that and what you're capable of doing in low light conditions, then it kind of makes it easier in the field to know exactly just, how low you can go with your settings. So a lot of my photos actually come out darker than I would like them to be, but then I just end up exposing them a little brighter in Lightroom or Photoshop later on. But then it's nice on overcast days, you don't really have that harsh light, so you can actually expose the way you want to. And a lot of the time, the wolves at the carcass, they were more or less still if they were just sitting or just eating. So I could bump up the brightness a little more to capture some of the action in the shadows. So I'm constantly changing it in the field, just depending on light conditions.
Yeah, definitely. And the perspective of the one with the salmon ringing around the bear, that's
Mhm.
like, were you up on a cliffside? How did you get that perspective looking down on that?
Yeah, I was up on a cliff. I think it was probably like 80 feet up a cliff or something, just looking down at the bears. And this was actually on a research trip in Katmai National Park. So I used to be a ranger working there. And we would go out into the Katmai backcountry and um, tally the number of fishermen that we saw out there, salmon activity, the number of bears that we could see in a particular spot. So that's what we were doing up there, was just counting bears. And luckily, we had such a great vantage point to look down on the river and actually see the salmon moving in the river below us. So I tried to get a lot of aerial shots that way, and showing bears fishing was just so much better too. It really just kind of brings that relationship full circle.
It's amazing. And just like, would did did the bear launch off of a rock and then come down into the salmon, or is it standing and collapsed on? Like, what was the
I
situation here?
I don't know if like this bear really knew what it was doing. Like a lot of them would do this like pouncing technique into a school of salmon, and sometimes they'd be successful. But there's some deep parts of the river where the salmon could easily just swim away. So he was just
Yeah,
kind of maneuvering through the river, and then he'd find a spot and then just leap into the salmon pool. Um, it worked out for him occasionally, so he
yeah,
must know what he was doing. But also in the summertime, they just have so much salmon out there that they can afford to be a little picky, or they can afford to um like I've actually seen them catch salmon and then only eat like the brains, the belly, and then the skin, just the most nutritious parts of the fish, and then let the rest of it go because they can afford to be picky in that way.
that's amazing. And it's so wild to me, you know, us guiding in Yellowstone to picture not obviously not this scale quite and not quite like this, but to picture what it must have been like when grizzlies were fishing the Yellowstone River at the fishing bridge, when the
Hmm.
cutthroat trout populations were at their peak. It's just hard for me to picture what it would have been like, that you could theoretically, and it wouldn't be the bright reds that you see here. It'd be more kind of a coppery orange, but to think that maybe this picture could have been possible there,
Right.
when that ecosystem was fully intact,
Hmm.
is pretty neat. Did you, on this one, were you using a polarizing filter at all to be able to get the clarity into the water, or was the angle just right? It seems like it must have been pretty sunny for the bear to be so lit up that way.
Yeah, this is actually before I knew a lot about filters, so I didn't have a polarizing filter on. I probably should have actually, but it was like a bright sunny day. So with this photo, I've actually gone back and edited it multiple times with like multiple
Yeah.
iterations just to get it exactly how I want it. But yeah, there was a lot of highlights on the bear I had to bring down. The salmon were actually a little washed out with just how the water wasn't murky necessarily, but it wasn't as clear as it like might appear in this picture. So I kind of bumped up the reds a little bit just so you could really see all of those individual fish in there. Um, but yeah, polarizing filters are great, and
Yeah.
it's also great in the winter too when you'd have such bright light all the time.
Right. I find that I don't use them as often. It just feels like an extra thing to think about. I often, like, even though I know objectively I should use them, I'm not often reaching for them.
Yeah,
And
I try to keep my
with
kit
this,
as simple as possible.
yeah, yeah. With this one, did you have a string of shots? Were you shooting in like a burst mode, or was this the one moment? Was it hard to pick which one among the bursts that you had?
Yeah, I did. I do remember doing a like high speed continuous shooting for this specific scene, and I chose this particular photo because the salmon are all still really clustered by the bear. They haven't like swum
Yeah,
away as far yet, and you can also see both paws outstretched. So just really showing like the movement in that picture, which is what I really wanted to capture. That was the goal for that picture. So yeah, I do like the high burst pictures because you can really just narrow in on which specific one you really love.
yeah, absolutely. Cool. Well, this next one I'm excited to look at because I think it's just majestic. So I'm gonna pull these ones up. Talk to me about what animal this is. What are we looking at, and what's kind of this ecological moment that you're capturing here?
So these are greater sage grouse, and they're a keystone species in the West because they're really good indicators of sagebrush habitat. So if you have healthy populations of sage grouse, then you know that the sagebrush habitat is pretty good quality. And then that also means that that's good habitat for multiple other species like jackrabbits and mule deer and foxes. So they're not a species I think a lot of people think of when they think of like iconic Western species, but I do really love sage grouse, and I'm actually really excited to try to go photograph their leks again this spring. So April is always when I start thinking about breeding season for birds like this. And so going back to like which behaviors I'm looking for in these pictures with birds, particularly sage grouse, I'm looking for that mating behavior because as we know, birds go really are really into that. And so these mating displays can be really eccentric And sage grouse, the yellow bulb that you see on the chest in the right picture, it actually inflates. And so it's an air sac that just inflates with air. And it makes this like weird bubbly popping sound. So
Ooh.
if you're out, yeah, exactly. So if you're out at a lek, so when I say lek, I just mean like an area where these males are displaying for females, like hundreds of them displaying for females, and it just sounds like a bubble bath out there. It's just like bloop 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 all over the place. And I
It's
also really
so
like that I got
fascinating.
the photo on the left too, so you could see the difference between males and females and just how much more extravagant the males are.
That one strikes me. It just feels like a painting because of the composition being almost too perfect. Like
Mhm.
just that they're just both looking off in the same direction, and it's such a perfect. It looks like it belongs in a Sibley book as a drawing of like here's the side by side comparison of what they look like.
Well, thank
Um,
you.
it's really, really neat. I feel like so often you see the images like you have on the right here, or even when the that vocal sac is expanded fully. Um, and it's really neat to see one like that. I just hadn't seen that before. And the ruffles on their feathers are just so outrageous.
Like they belong in a like fashion show, like the
Yes,
white
they really
scarf,
do. They
the
really do.
the pointed feathers. Yeah, they've got it all.
And I'm always amazed, people on this call, maybe they've flown into the Jackson Hole Airport. And that airport, the field itself, I know you know this, Riley, but for folks that are on, it's one of the most successful leks in the region. There's this huge sage grouse lek right next to the airfield. And there have been a lot of studies to try and figure out, well, even considering moving the airport because of to protect that lek, and seemingly, from what I've read, and correct me if I'm wrong, Riley, but seemingly the decision has been it seems like they're doing pretty all right, even though this airport is going right over their heads. Have you
Mhm.
heard anything different than that, Riley?
Not yeah, I haven't really heard too much about that lek recently. But yeah, they're pretty hardy species, so you'll find them in places you would never expect. Um, but yeah, they are a good indicator of good sagebrush habitat. So it must mean that they're still doing pretty well despite the huge airport there.
Yeah. And this next series of images is also really exciting too. Let me just get on the right one. Um, Talk to me about these here. Like this is a very different composition than what we've seen previously.
Mhm.
What about these images are jumping out to you?
So lately, in the past couple years, I've also begun to shift my focus away from, I mentioned like portraits of wildlife where they're looking right at you and it's like a perfect frame of their face, to behaviors that relate a lot to their ecology. And now I like moving more towards capturing animals in the environment that they live in to really show the conditions that they're enduring, where they spend most of their time. And I feel like a lot of these images actually help conservation efforts a lot more too, when you can really see the big picture of where these animals are moving and living and traveling. So I'll just kind of take each one of these one by one. So the pronghorn on the far left, they live in these wide open prairie ecosystems and valleys. So you'll find them a lot in Yellowstone in these big wide open meadows like Lamar Valley. Right outside of Gardner, there's a big meadow out there. And they do these really impressive migrations every year, travel hundreds of miles from Wyoming all the way down south to the southern United States and then back again. And their migration has been the topic of a lot of conservation efforts out west, particularly when it comes to highway overpasses, so that they can safely cross over these major highways, the barriers that fences create. So capturing them in this big ecosystem, I think, really just highlights where they're living, and the fact that they've been here since the Ice Age, continuing to do all of these traditional migratory routes is really, really impressive to me. So I like showing pronghorn in these big wide open meadows. And then the bear in the second picture, this was also taken on the Katmai Coast. And I like that this shows volcanic ash on the mountains behind the bear. So
Mm.
Katmai is a really unique place because it does have such a high concentration of bears, but it's also the site of the Nova Eruptive volcanic explosion from 1912 that just blanketed the entire park in ash. You can actually go out to this place called the Valley of 10,000 Smokes, which is basically just an entire valley that's just solidified ash over time. It kind of looks like the columns of a slot canyon in southern Utah, just with the way it's solidified and how the colors have changed. So bears are really living in this unique place in the world where they have volcanoes right next door to these salmon streams. So I really wanted to capture that with the bear as like the sole focus of this picture too. And then bison, of course, inhabiting Yellowstone, have to live around these geyser basins and these hot springs. And again, Yellowstone is also a volcanic place too. So I love showing bison in front of these geyser basins and how they use the landscape. And especially in wintertime, I find that a lot of them actually congregate near these thermal areas because it's hot. So they can kind of get a reprieve from walking through deep snow. Um, the grass is usually uncovered in these areas, so they have a lot easier time eating. But it is a little bit of a double-edged sword because bison have been known to fall into the hot springs and get scalded. And the grass that they're eating is actually rich with silica. So silica is kind of this like white textury mineral that is taken up by a lot of the trees and runoff in the hot water coming out of these thermal features. And it actually grinds down their teeth over time a lot quicker than if they were to, eat grass not rich with silica. So they end up dying of starvation a lot sooner in life than they would otherwise. So kind of a love-hate relationship with these thermal features, but bison and geyser is a very like quintessential Yellowstone pick.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and then the snowy owl on the far right, I finally got to find snowy owls a few years back when I was living in Michigan. I found a spot where they tend to congregate in the winter, and I drove like 4 hours out there early in the morning to try to find them. And I was kind of expecting to find maybe like one or two, but I ended up seeing like 10 to 12 that day. So snowy
Wow.
owls, I think a lot of people think of them on the tundra in this like wide open, wild, like remote ecosystem. But a lot of the snowy owls I found were on farmland and perched on, telephone poles and on barns. So I liked this picture a lot to actually just show where they actually are, and then to get a size reference too. So snowy owls, they're not the largest owl species in North America, but they are still pretty big. So showing one perched on top of a barn kind of brought that all together too.
Yeah, I love that. I think for me, thinking about like my photography trajectory, I used to like when I first started, it was really purist. Like I didn't want any indication that humans are on the landscape at all.
Hmm.
And I feel myself like being more comfortable. I'm still pretty bad at incorporating it, but like getting more comfortable trying to blur the edges and show the interconnectedness. And I
Yeah.
love that shot. And I think what you said too, like wildlife photography often is so hard to get scale.
Hmm.
And I love in that shot how you really have a sense of like how big that owl is.
Yeah. I liked how it came out in the end.
Yeah, definitely. This next one I'm about to share is just an epic shot. It's the one I feel like it's the one that everybody wants to have this in their library of the frost-covered bison head. And but can you tell me, is there a time that you've had where you've worked really hard to get a photo or like just I feel like sometimes photos just come really easily and sometimes you just have to put in time and effort and just like keep working at it until you get the one that you want. Where does this image kind of fall on that spectrum?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question a lot actually, because I feel like with a lot of my photos, when you think of like, I worked hard for a picture, I'm not necessarily like crawling on my hands and knees in like 12 feet deep snow, waiting like 12 hours a day for something to come out. But this picture was taken on my first season as a snow coach guide in Yellowstone. And some of the days can be brutally cold. So, this day I think was started off at negative 33 degrees Fahrenheit. The coldest tour I had this season started off at negative 43 degrees Fahrenheit. So just being willing to endure those conditions for a picture like this, I think is really what strikes me as like, yeah, I got that picture like in the end. So yeah, to get that hoarfrost uh, on the bison face, you have to have really cold temperatures. So below freezing for sure, usually in the negative, so like -10, -20 degrees. And oftentimes the bison are not, close by you when they have this hoarfrost. So you kind of have to position yourself in a way where it's really going to highlight that. And with this picture, I especially love the hoarfrost bison face in front and then the bison that seems totally fine in the back. So sometimes the
Yeah.
hoarfrost shows up a little better when they're, using their faces to shovel through snow to get grass. So it also tells a little bit of a story of just bison ecology, where they're using their huge head to just shovel away snow day after day for hours and hours, getting snow. Where some bison may not, be as good of that, or might not find the right spots. So maybe the bison on the left side was just being a little lazier that day.
I love that. And this one, was this a tricky one to edit afterwards? Like kind of with that trying to get the right contrast between the frost and the fur, or was this kind of flat out of the camera? It's hard to get a sense of what the lighting was like. This wasn't direct. Maybe it was kind of high clouds.
Yeah, it
I think.
was it was I think from what I remember an overcast day. But especially on these cold days, and I think there's actually a lot of shadows in this picture too, because it was still early in the morning.
Yeah.
White balance is really important in the winter time, so a lot of my photos, like right out of the camera, look pretty blue, and so you have to
Yeah.
just kind of edit that back to the how it looked in real time. So I definitely did bump up the temperature on this a lot. And then just really bringing out the snow on this dark fur. I bumped up the contrast a lot too on the face to really highlight that. Background, I softened up so it wasn't as blue, but you could still see that it's like this wintry, frosty landscape. So yeah, I'm kind of happy with how this came out, but I did have to do a fair amount of editing to get it to like true life to how I imagined it in my head.
Yeah, I mean, I can picture this shot. Like I just it to me feels really natural the way that you've put it together, and I can also tell that this would be a big challenge to get right in
Yeah,
post production.
yeah.
Um, but can you speak a little bit? You mentioned that this was kind of a dark moment. Can you speak a little bit to, a lot of times wildlife are active dawn and dusk.
Mhm.
What are some strategies that you use to try and counteract the fact that you have low light conditions, or um, kind of how do you manage that? And what are some tricks that you've come up with over the years?
So a lot of my photography in Yellowstone happens early in the day because that's when wildlife is most active. And early at dawn and dusk, you're going to get really low light conditions. And so a lot of it depends on the subject that I'm photographing. So most of the time, like with wolves, they're on the move, they're doing something active, they're interacting with each other. So you want to capture that motion in time and kind of freeze it so it's not blurry. So you still have to have a high shutter speed for that. And so to compensate, I lower my f-stop to about 7.1 if I can, and then bump up my ISO a little bit. So I do sacrifice a little bit of noise to get that action frozen in time. But with bison, they're really I guess lazy is the wrong word, but they're very immobile in the winter for the most part because they're just focused on finding food and conserving energy. So with bison, like this scene, they were just standing planted in the road for a while. So I could actually reduce my shutter speed a bit to let in more light, and then I can lower my ISO to reduce some of the noise in this picture too. So I was able to just kind of balance my camera on like the window of the snow coach. I think I was maybe out in the snow coach for some of these pictures and then outside for others, or just hold as still as you can, balance it on your knee. If you have a tripod, that's even better. But yeah, you can bring out a lot of the details a lot more when your shutter speed is lower because then you are capturing more of that detail and reducing noise and reducing some of the blurriness that you would get otherwise. So yeah, for this one, I was just as still as I could be trying to get the detail out, but it was nice that they cooperated and they were also still.
Yeah, I love. in this shot, for some reason, I really like the hoof, like where it's kind of lit up by the sun and contrasted against the snow. I feel like in the summer and the spring, when you're photographing bison, it's usually their feet just kind of blend in to the surroundings, and just the way the light is hitting that, I think it's a nice little extra detail in this photo.
Yeah,
Um,
I like it.
it's nice. I feel one of my favorite questions for photographers too is like, I'm always curious when I get back to the editing room and I'm going through my photos, sometimes like a photo just takes me by surprise where it's like, oh, I didn't even know I got that. Or yeah, like, are there any moments that stand out to you where just the moment surprised you or you didn't expect to get a certain photograph?
hmm So recently, so those past wolf pictures that I had on the other slides, that same encounter, there were wolves that would, leave the carcass and then come back to it. And so that was a good time for me to get individual wolves by themselves. And I was photographing one of the wolves kind of like walking adjacent to our group, and a raven just photobombed right in front of the wolf, which I didn't expect at all. And I actually was scrolling, yeah, exactly what you said, scrolling through my camera later at the end of the day, and I'm like, oh my gosh, there's a wolf. Like, it looks like the wolf is looking right at the raven. So this is like now one of my new favorite photos of all time. Um,
It's
and
so amazing. And just the movement that you have, like, it's the perfect balance of that raven both being sharp enough to see the details, but also like you feel the movement and it's the way its claws are blurred. It's
uh-huh.
such a cool shot.
It's like it was crazy that it like ended up that way. And inadvertently, I've always wanted to get a photo of ravens and wolves together because they have just this symbiotic relationship where wolves will bring down a carcass, open it up for the ravens. And so, like 100% of the time, there's an animal carcass out on the landscape that's brought down by wolves or bears. There's going to be ravens on it. And they like follow wolf packs to these carcass sites because they know that, wolves usually mean food for them too. So I've been wanting to highlight this relationship in some way, and so yeah, just by accident I kind of ended up doing that a couple weeks ago.
And I love that the size comparison is like so, that's one of photography's strengths, I think, is like juxtaposing things that are close with things that are further away and making them seem like they're the same size. Like this shot, composition wise, and just the moment is so interesting. Yeah, do you have any prints of this one?
Not yet, but I'm definitely printing this out for myself too,
Yeah.
just to have it up in my room somewhere.
If someone's interested in getting prints from you, do you have a process for that? Do they just reach out by email or?
Yeah, I think it's easiest to email me about it or message me on Instagram. I do have an Etsy shop. I'm really bad at maintaining it. So I've been meaning to like update that shop with some more recent pictures. But yeah, for sure, if you want a picture like this from me, or if you see any that I post on my Instagram page that you want as a print, I'm more than happy to like get that for you.
That's awesome. This one, I can see this looking really cool, just gigantic.
I am so obsessed with how this came out.
So you were talking about on this, were you saying that at this site there was a kill as well?
Yeah,
And that's kind of
there
why
was
they were
just
coming around.
yeah, just to the left of this wolf. He's actually walking away from the carcass. So on the next slide, actually, I have a photo of that carcass and where all these wolves were congregated. So we actually just showed up in the park that day, hoping that they would be around, and we saw like a couple wolves out in the meadow, and we were like, "Oh my gosh, this is awesome!" And then we go further, and the carcass is like right by the road. So it was an amazing day for photography, to say the least.
No kidding. So I always struggle with this personally of like figuring out the balance of showing nature being nature and then like is there a point at which there's more gore than tells the story? Like how do you wrestle with that? Wildlife is dramatic, is and prey and predator relationships. Like how do you navigate which photos make it into the library that you share and which ones don't?
I feel like I don't really shy away from like the gore and grotesqueness of nature a lot of the times because I do photograph a lot of predators, and that's just the reality of life for them. So, like bears and salmon, I really loved how that particular photo turned out because the salmon is also in focus, and you can clearly see it's a chum salmon or a humpy salmon, I guess is the nickname. But yeah, the bear and salmon relationship is super important. Like I talked about, the wolves on that bison carcass, that's the carcass is a really, prime spot for them where I mentioned a lot of these behaviors play out. And again, that's just the reality of wolves. And then on kind of the non-gore side, there I've encountered wildlife that's been injured or sick or dying. And so this photo on the bottom, this is taken in 2018, after my time with the southern resident killer whales. But this is a mother orca called Tahlequah, and she had a stillborn calf, or she had a calf that died after an hour after it was born. So she went on this 17-day tour of grief, just carrying this calf at the surface, and she, foregoed food to hold up her baby, and pod members would, take turns to hold it up while she went and got food, and then she'd come right back to it. So miraculously, just like on a random trip out there in 2018, she swam by the lighthouse in front of us, and I was able
Oh my
to
gosh.
capture that on camera. So I debated like sharing that photo for the longest time, but I think it also just highlights the reality that the southern residents are facing, where they have a severe lack of Chinook salmon. So part of the reason why they're having so many miscarriages and having so many stillbirths is because they just simply don't have enough food to sustain these pregnancies, or so these calves can survive for more than a couple months. So I think it's important to actually just highlight really what they're going through too on a conservation standpoint level.
Definitely. I mean, the power of that story. I mean, there's so much emotion behind that, and empathy that the animal is showing, and yeah, I think that image is incredibly powerful. I can also understand why you sat on it for a little bit before
Mhm.
sharing it. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, it's
Well,
still happening, so it's still relevant.
yeah, yeah, it's amazing. Um, the other thing I wanted to talk about before we wrap up pretty soon here is you have some pretty amazing research that you just wrapped up. So in addition to being a photographer, you're also an ecologist and a expedition leader for Natural Habitat Adventures and other companies. But tell me a little bit about the research that you just wrapped up. What's kind of the elevator pitch that you have for what you worked on?
So I just barely finished my master's degree in October. I defended in October. And I was studying the gut microbiomes of African herbivores. So basically, your body is made up of trillions of microorganisms, which we call microbes. It's the like good bacteria in your gut that helps you digest food. It regulates even your mood. It's impacted by stress and geography and sex. So all different factors kind of coalesce to drive this diversity of bacteria in your gut. So my project was looking at 11 different African herbivore species in Namibia, and I was trying to determine what drives diversity in these different species. So, all together as a community, and then I looked at it by individual species. Um, and basically, I found that there's a lot of different drivers. So, sex plays a role, whether the animals are ruminants or non ruminants plays a role. And I highlighted elephants here because they have specific bacteria in their gut found in most elephants in the park that most of the other herbivores don't have in high abundance. And elephants are mixed feeders. So it makes sense that their bacteria would be really diverse, and they would have these specialized microbes to help them digest food in a way where they can, eat a lot of different food items. And so on top of that, the study area that we were at was Etosha National Park, which is a really dry desert ecosystem. A lot of these animals congregate at water holes to feed. So their microbes are also adapting to that harsh environment and kind of compensating for that as well.
Mhm. Would you have is this a pretty new area of research, or do we have a database that goes back a number of years to be able to see if microbial ecosystem, habitats within their digestive tracts are changing over time?
So that was really the goal of this study too was to just establish a baseline data for what these
Yeah.
herbivore gut microbiomes look like. So, if climate change continues to dry up this ecosystem in the next coming years, we can see how their baseline, levels shift over time if they're
Yeah.
compensating for that as well. And microbial research is relatively new. There's been studies done in, the 50s and 60s on this, but a lot of the technology we have now, like PCR and uh, amplification, machines for microbiology. That's a lot of new technology. So there's still so much, we have yet to discover in this area of research. So that's me in the in the bottom left extracting DNA from these fecal samples, 312 of them to be exact.
I I also worked uh, in genetics and looking at the population dynamics of sawshell turtles, and I actually developed tendonitis from too many pipetting episodes. That's a fun fact.
that's that's not surprising to me.
No, I feel like it's hard, even as a ecologist who, you're constantly kind of thinking about what you're doing and connecting all of it. But it's hard as you're pipetting and doing all those, going through the motions, right? It's hard conceptually to hold on to the bigger picture of what you're doing. Like sometimes when you're pipetting, you're just like in the depths of pipetting, and it doesn't make sense that what you're doing is actually going to lead to answering the question. Like I think
Yeah,
it's cool to
you get
see a picture of it because I feel like it's kind of the lost time that not too many people look at.
hmm
Yeah,
exactly.
lots of time in the lab.
Ain't
Well,
that?
just just a couple more slides here. I know I want to leave at least time for one question at the end. But you and I had the chance to guide together in Yellowstone, which was such a blast. We had such a wonderful group of people. What are some of your favorite parts of guiding there? And what types of photo opportunities are most exciting to you in that area?
I was on this one tour where this woman had never been to Yellowstone before, and after we went through like Old Faithful and all the geyser basins and saw wolves and had a great day, she was like, "Wow, I thought Yellowstone was just a flat field with like a single geyser, Old Faithful, and then you just go out of the park." Like I'm like, "No, it is way more dynamic than that." So yeah, the geyser basins and the thermal features in Yellowstone are actually what made it a park in the first place. So it was set aside in 1872 to protect these thermal features. So I always try to incorporate that into my photography in some way, shape, or form throughout the seasons. The colors stand out a lot more in the summertime. The steam is a lot more dramatic in the winter. So I try to, find these quintessential Yellowstone photos like that bison with the geyser in the background and incorporate these in a creative way into my pictures. And then on top of that, Yellowstone is a hub for all sorts of wildlife species. It's called the Little Serengeti of North America. So it's easy to actually get a lot of multiple species in your pictures. So I like this one with the coyotes and otters, kind of showing their love hate relationship with each other. But yeah, it's like a wildlife photographer's paradise, essentially.
Definitely. Yeah. And coming from like the Adirondacks where I live, it's always so amazing to just get these wide open vistas with nothing in your way. And you can just, kind of set up the shot exactly how you want it or be patient for the wildlife to show up.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot of fun to be able to photograph there.
And
And
I have
this,
another,
is
oh, sorry,
that
I was
a
going to say, I have another
color?
Nat webinar I did about Yellowstone through the seasons. So I kind of go
Nice.
season by season to show like what there is to photograph each season.
Oh, that's amazing. So I bet, so if we search Rylee Jensen daily dose of nature, I bet it would probably come up that way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I did it back in December.
And this is this a collared wolf moving
hmm
across that area?
Yeah, so
Wow.
this is one of those situations that I was just talking about where I like to show like quintessential Yellowstone. So, A, one of the best places in the world to see wild wolves, and then B, you have all of these thermal features. So, I was really happy that this pack decided to walk right in front of all of these thermal features so you could get that dynamic Yellowstone interaction side by side with each other. So this ended up being, yeah, like one of my favorite photos of all time, just showing
Yeah,
the, like, this is unmistakably in Yellowstone that this picture was taken.
right. Yeah, that's really, really neat. So many stories can come out of just that, I feel like.
Hmm.
I think, I one of the things I'm curious about too is how your scientific background relates to photography. Like, do you find that the way that you photograph is different because of that ecological knowledge that you have?
Yeah, I think so. And a lot of that doesn't just come from the wildlife specific jobs that I've had in the past. So this photo in above me with the binoculars shows me doing balsam fir surveys in Isle Royale National Park in Michigan. So I was out there to just measure the browsing condition of these balsam fir trees, which are the favorite food of moose out there. And so knowing habitat and where certain animals like to move in their specific habitats and how that plays into like where these animals are going to be found. I think that really has been ingrained in my head since college, just like learning about all of that and where exactly like where these animals are going to be found in different ecosystems. And then on top of that, you can get on more of a microscopic level and find tracks and scat, knowing, oh, okay, yeah, this is a wolf print and it was probably walking through here because it's on its way to a river or like to find elk or bison or caribou, depending on which ecosystem it's in. And then bear scat is one of my favorite things to find in the field because it changes season by season. So early in June, they're still feeding on like seeds and roots and tubers, and then they move on to salmon around July, and then they move on to berries in August. So it looks different depending on which season that you're out there. So that also plays into photography and like what you're actually going to be photographing the bear doing at that particular time of year. So tracking has really been a big part of what I do.
Very, very cool. Um, well, we're running out of time here. I want to leave room for one question. Brooke, is there a question that rises to the top?
Wow, thank you both so much. We do have some questions rolling in right now. So let's see. Since this is a photography webinar, we'll try to stick more on the photography questions, but let's see here. Hmm. Ooh, this is oh, I like this question. I would like to ask both of you um, this one, but Riley, we'll start with you. I'm just going to read this to you verbatim. So it says, you mentioned the personalities of several species that you photograph. Do you find yourself looking for those quote unquote human moments before you press the shutter button?
Yeah, so anthropomorphism is kind of like a dirty word. Like a lot of scientists are like, oh, like we shy away from that. We don't like to give human qualities to animals that may not have like the same human emotions. But I do find that I like to do a little bit of both. So highlighting, the animal's personality with, foxes in particular, wide open mouths, like greeting each other. That's just a very foxy thing for them to do, but we can also relate to that because they look excited, like our dogs when we come home from work and they're super excited to see us. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to try to find human emotions in animals because it does help people relate to them in a way. As long as it's accurate, like you're not completely misconstruing what you're photographing. But I think it does help promote, good feelings about these animals. And then in the end, in the big picture of things, helping people to care about them, their conservation in a way too.
Charlie, do you want to take a
Yeah,
stab at that same question?
it's a great question. I think for me, I'm always like it. My favorite wildlife photos communicate some type of like a feeling. Like I'm trying to evoke a kindred sense with the creature that I'm taking pictures of. And I think just like Riley mentioned, we're both uh, similar age, and so when we were in school, especially in high school and early college years, um, it was anthropomorphizing was really, really a dirty word, and you kind of grew up knowing like humans are on a different plane than the rest of the animal kingdom, and I think in recent years, in the last decade, since I've been out of school, like we're starting to see that line get blurred more and more. We're seeing more and more examples of empathy in the animal kingdom. We're seeing more examples of high cognitive function that's really challenging this perception of humans being separate and much more being one of the larger animal kingdom. So I think for me and my photography, like I'm really trying to communicate that in the moments that I capture as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you both for answering that. And also, not that my 2 cents matters, but being a scientist myself, they're finding that a lot of these same hormones that create these emotion in us are also found in these other species. So is the emotion actually any different if the chemical
Right.
hormones are creating the same thing? So I don't know. Food for thought, everybody. I listen to a lot of stuff. But all right, everyone, we have reached the top of the hour. So, Charlie and Riley, I will turn it to you for any last closing comments.
Well, Riley, thank
Um,
you so much for doing this. This is a treat to get to see your photos and hear about, what went into taking them. And I'd encourage everyone to go check out Riley's website, and I'll let you uh, give some guidance on how to get there. But then the other thing I'll just mention that I forgot to ask you about, we'll have to do a follow-up
yeah.
webinar. Uh, you were just part of a documentary on wildlife photographers, and so your work is getting really recognized, and you're starting to, cast a wider net in where your photography is showing up. So congratulations, and yeah, share with the viewers how they can find more of your work too.
Yeah. Thanks for asking me to be a part of this in the first place. Yeah, I love sharing my photos with people. I love, helping people get into wildlife photography and, just kind of up their skills a little bit too. So if there was something you wanted to ask me during this presentation that we just didn't have time for, feel free to look me up on Instagram. I respond pretty quick on there. It's Rylee, so RYLEE_J underscore photo. And yeah, more than happy to answer any questions you have. And you're right. I also just filmed a documentary with BBC Earth. So I think my episode is actually just released today. So if you go to their YouTube channels, the BBC Earth Explorer channels, there's an episode about me in the field in Yellowstone that you can watch. It's kind of surreal to even say that. um, but yeah, it's been really exciting for me this whole journey from starting off teenager me photography into where I am now. So yeah, you can check out my Instagram. I'll try to post more on there lately. And I'm also happy to answer questions over email too. So riley.j.photo@gmail.com.
And that's Jay, Riley
Yes.
dot
Yeah.
Jay. Okay.
Hmm.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Riley, and congratulations on that feature. And thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you both so much. This was very entertaining and so insightful. And congratulations again, Riley. I remember you telling me about that. So it's wonderful that it's on air. I would like to thank everybody who tuned in. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we'll have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.